Welcome to the She Leads podcast, a space that empowers women like you to build success in a way that feels authentic, energizing, and aligned with who you really are. In a world that tries to convince us that success means hustling harder and following everyone else's rules, we're here to rewrite the script. This is about success that feels nourishing, not depleting. Success that brings the fulfillment, impact, and recognition you deserve, whilst ultimately giving you the financial power to create the future you want and inspire meaningful change in the world around you. Make sure to hit the follow button so that you never miss an episode, and come and say hello on Instagram. You can find us at she_leads.academy. Let's dive in. Hello ladies, and welcome to a brand new episode of the She Leads show. Let's talk imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome, it is something that comes up a lot in my work. It's something that I've spoken about frequently, but something that I've been thinking about more recently is how we've been taught to see imposter syndrome as almost this flaw that lives inside of us, as if it's evidence of maybe broken confidence, a gap in our courage, and really something that we've got to fix in order to finally belong at the table. So it's almost framed as this private defect, this personal weakness, something that we can conquer through, mindset shifts or coaching or endless self-improvement. But here's a question. What if imposter syndrome isn't a flaw at all? What if it's actually a mirror? A reflection of the cultures, the systems, the definitions of leadership that women have had to navigate, spaces that questioned our worth, spaces that maybe diminished our voices and really forced us to contort ourselves into molds never designed with us in mind. Now, for many women, especially successful, ambitious women, we know imposter syndrome well. Maybe the women we work with, if we're in the space, in the coaching space, maybe this is something that we come into contact with frequently. You've seen this play out so many times. A woman maybe earns a promotion that she's worked years for. She's qualified, she's capable, she's respected by her peers. But instead of celebrating, she finds herself lying awake at night wondering maybe she was the safe choice. Maybe eventually the other people around her will realize that she's not as competent as they think. Maybe we have a woman who's a business owner, an entrepreneur. She's built a thriving business. She's built it from scratch. Yet, despite her successes, she still questions, am I good enough? What if the people who hire me don't see my value? What if they ask for a refund? These stories, they're not unusual. They are familiar to countless of women. This is imposter syndrome, that feeling of just never feeling quite good enough despite all evidence to the contrary. Now, I remember first learning this term, even imposter syndrome. I was like, okay, this really makes sense. I'm somebody who's really struggled to see my value, even when, I had the grades, the achievements, I got the job. I was like, okay, maybe I'm going to get figured out at some point. There was a part of me that just felt like perhaps I'm just winging it here. I'm getting lucky somehow. And eventually it's going to catch up with me and I'm going to get found out. So it felt really useful to have a label to put to what I was feeling. But then when I started to do the work on my imposter syndrome, a lot of the effort was focused on fixing something within me. It was like, okay, I don't have enough confidence or enough inner worthiness, and that's something that I have to fix. And I think this is the issue with imposter syndrome. I'm now seeing that it's often labeled as this personal flaw lodged in the mind of individual women. And it can always be treated like a defect of our personality, something that we have to change. It's this invisible crack in our confidence that we've got to patch up through, self-help or coaching or even just through grit. And the language even around imposter syndrome reinforces this idea. We're told to overcome imposter syndrome, or we learn how to manage it, as if it's this problem that begins and ends with our own heads, our own minds. And this framing actually isolates the experience. It makes women feel that the doubt is theirs alone to fix, rather than that doubt being the product of a broader system that has actually conditioned us to question our worth in the first place. So for this episode today, I'd like to invite you to consider, what if imposter syndrome is not an internal flaw at all? What if it's actually a conditioned response to external forces, a natural consequence of working within systems that have been built to doubt women? In business especially, where women are still underrepresented in leadership roles, they're frequently underestimated in boardrooms, in business. the constant questioning, the scrutiny, the double standards, these really leave a mark. And self-doubt, it doesn't arise from nowhere. It's something that's learned, it's reinforced, it's normalized until even accomplished women start to believe it belongs to them. Self-doubt is part of their identity. Now, again, this is a really different perspective from what we're often taught with imposter syndrome. When I first learned about it, it was really presented as a mindset problem. And the solutions were really rooted in self-help language, speak up more, silence your inner critic, fake it until you make it. You've probably heard those terms too. Women are told to lean in harder, build resilience, reframe negative thoughts. The burden of change rests squarely on the individual, the woman, as though our doubt exists in isolation from the culture around us. So if we think about in professional settings, this framing has become kind of a shorthand. So if a woman hesitates to put herself forward for a promotion or downplays her achievements, the explanation is often reduced to, she's got imposter syndrome. We start to label ourselves as having this thing, imposter syndrome. But rarely is the environment itself interrogated. So whether she's being overlooked or undervalued or consistently measured against harsher standards, these things are often never brought into the conversation. So by labeling the issue as a confidence gap, we're actually implying that women are the problem and therefore responsible for fixing themselves. Now, there's a part of me that's all for this, taking this radical responsibility to work on yourself for personal, professional, spiritual, emotional growth. But I think here we're overlooking the bigger picture. This framing where we're saying okay, this is an internal problem. It's not only incomplete, but it's dangerous because it obscures the structural forces that are at play here. It places the weight on women to adapt rather than challenging the systems that perpetuate the doubt in the first place. So what we're doing here with this label is we're suggesting that women carry the problem inside themselves. And, if you just work harder on your confidence, the doubts are going to disappear. But again, this really hides the bigger truth that women's self-doubt doesn't arise in a vacuum. It's actually shaped by the environments that we're moving through, where our authority is questioned more often, where our ideas are maybe interrupted, maybe even our ambition is measured against harsher standards. So if we think about, let's say, take the corporate workplace. Let's say a woman is in a meeting and she's sharing her ideas and nobody really is picking up on any of them. But a male colleague then repeats pretty much the same ideas and gets all of the recognition. Now, let's say this happens multiple times. Over time, she doesn't just register the pattern. She actually internalizes this pattern. She tells herself, maybe I'm not clear enough. Maybe I need to fix the way I speak. Yet the real problem isn't her communication. It's the culture that undervalues a woman's voice. Let's think of another example. Let's think of a woman let's say she's built a thriving coaching business. She helps her clients and she's got a steady stream of clients, great testimonials, financial stability. Yet when she talks about her work, she often plays it down. It's nothing special. I just help a little bit, people with their confidence. She plays down her accomplishments. And maybe when she comes to pricing, she struggles too, because I see this play out a lot. Women really struggling to own their financial power. Now, this woman, she knows how great she is. She can see the results she's creating, but when it's time to share what she charges, she quickly adds in something. So it might be saying, of course I can discount it if that feels too high. Now, on the surface, it might look like a lack of confidence, but reality is it's actually an adaptation to cultural messaging that women who stand fully in their financial power, fully in their worth, risk being judged as greedy or arrogant or maybe out of touch. So this hesitation she has around saying her prices or really honouring her value, it's not evidence of a lack of confidence in her abilities. It's actually a survival mechanism. So what we're doing by labelling imposter syndrome as this thing for us that we need to fix, we're placing the weight on women to adapt. And in the meantime, the real forces that are at play here remain untouched, unchallenged. So we have to keep adjusting ourselves or doubting ourselves, minimizing ourselves, whilst the systems that created these doubts just carry on. And this is why framing imposter syndrome as this personal defect is not a complete picture. And it's also very harmful because it is reinforcing the very dynamic that it claims to fix. So if we think about something, I think that very common phrase that a lot of women who struggle with imposter syndrome have, that phrase, "you don't belong here." That phrase is often just an echo of what society has already said out loud. So really, I don't think imposter syndrome is necessarily about a lack of confidence, but instead about the environments that continually undermine a woman's confidence. So if we see imposter syndrome, if we understand it more as conditioning rather than a personal flaw, its consequences, they take on a different way. So instead of just being this private struggle with confidence, it becomes a systematic issue with ripple effects for women's lives, for their careers, for their ambitions. And the most immediate cost is self-limitation. Women learning to hold themselves back, whether that's maybe not applying for a promotion unless they meet every single requirement. Maybe they don't speak up unless they're absolutely certain. This fear of being found out, it becomes a barrier to stepping forward even when the qualifications are there. And then there's also this toll I think women have on their visibility. Many women hesitating to pursue leadership roles or public recognition, not because they lack ability, but because they've seen how women in the spotlight are judged more harshly. That fear of criticism, that fear of being labelled as arrogant, the fear of stepping out of what is acceptable, it keeps women confined to safer, smaller versions of themselves. And then we've got the emotional cost, carrying the weight of constant self-doubt. It leads to anxiety, perfectionism, burnout. So instead of just enjoying their success, many women find themselves exhausted by the need to justify it. And there's that internalized question again, do I really belong here? It becomes this constant drain on a woman's energy, on her creativity. And these consequences, they're the direct result of environments that send women the message that they are out of place. And unless those environments change, the cycle of self-doubt is going to continue. Imposter syndrome, that cycle will never be broken. We can work on our mindset, but the environments we are in will mean those same fears keep coming up. And we just have women repeating the same pattern where they just quietly shrink their own potential to avoid judgment. Now, when I started to think about this a little bit more, what I also realized is that by treating imposter syndrome as this individual problem, we're actually misplacing both the cause, but also the responsibility for change. So if we're thinking about this as a personal problem, when we're told that the issue lies with our own mindset, the solution is all about self-correction. So be more confident, speak up more, fake it till you make it. And the underlying message is that if we still feel like imposters, we just haven't worked hard enough to fix ourselves. And this is very harmful because, again, it's obscuring the structural forces that produce the doubt in the first place. And it takes an experience rooted in systematic bias. So things like being interrupted, being overlooked, being measured against double standards. And it's reframing that as personal shortcomings. Now, instead of asking why so many women feel this way, why do so many women have imposter syndrome? Organizations and cultures can very conveniently say, oh, well, the problem is hers to solve. She needs to have more coaching. She needs to work on her limiting beliefs. And again, those things can be important and powerful. And it's not to say we abdicate all of our responsibility. What I'm saying here, imposter syndrome, it's not our responsibility alone to change. There was actually a really interesting study done by the Harvard Business Review on this. It actually found that women receive more vague personality-based feedback in the workplace. Things like be more collaborative, don't be too aggressive. Men, on the other hand, men were receiving much more actionable skill-based advice that was actually going to help them grow. So the result of this was that women internalized criticism as almost like these character flaws, but instead men were being coached towards progress, development. And even at the highest levels, these patterns persist. So again, female CEOs, I've spoken about this on my past episode, this thing where, women in power, women in positions of authority are often described as unlikable or too ambitious. But men, on the other hand, they're praised for their decisiveness. They're praised for their ambition and vision. So then again, we have this impossible double standards for women where they've got to constantly prove their competence. And when they inevitably absorb some of the doubt that society creates, it's mislabeled as imposter syndrome, as though the problem lives inside them and it's not this culture that shaped them. Now, what this ultimately does, and this is where I think it gets really dangerous, is it reinforces shame. Because women who feel like imposters often believe that they're the only ones struggling with this, when in reality their feelings are very widely shared. If we're viewing imposter syndrome as this internal flaw, it makes us think, there's something wrong with me. Like, why can't I just recognize, my value? Why do I lack this confidence? And especially if they're looking around at colleagues, female colleagues, who appear to be confident and, they're just getting on with life and with work, it makes them assume that they're the only ones that are struggling. I've seen this play out a lot in the online space where a woman will have, what she's labeling as imposter syndrome. And maybe she's seeing other online entrepreneurs that are taking up space, being visible, creating confidence. And they're thinking, why can't I just be like them? Why can't I just, own my value? Why do I have to be riddled with all of this self-doubt? They just assume that everybody else has it figured out. And they have this shame then around the self-doubt that they're feeling, which then just compounds the isolation. Instead of recognizing their doubts as a collective issue or a systematic experience, they're experiencing them as evidence of personal inadequacy. So we not only have the symptoms of what we're calling imposter syndrome, but then we also have stacked on top of this the feeling of shame. And the irony is, the more accomplished a woman becomes, the heavier that shame can feel, because visibility magnifies scrutiny. So any hint of self-doubt, we're kind of thinking, this is a weakness, so I can't even show this self-doubt. It's got to be hidden. And then this creates a vicious cycle again. The more women hide their imposter feelings, the more isolated they feel, and the more convinced they become that their struggle is unique. Shame thrives in secrecy. And when an imposter syndrome is treated as this personal flaw rather than a systematic issue, women in positions of power continue to battle with it behind closed doors. So then we've got all of the symptoms of imposter syndrome. Stacked on top of that is shame. And then we've also got this feeling of isolation. And again, it's that isolation that's often the hardest part. The feeling alone in your imposter syndrome. Everybody else has got it figured out. Why is everybody else confident and just can seem to get on with their businesses or their careers and progress? Yet I'm here and it's keeping me stuck. It's often something we don't feel like we can fully talk about, because let's say a woman is experiencing imposter syndrome at work. Maybe she's hesitant to admit that she feels undeserving of her role, because doing so risks confirming the very suspicion she fears others already hold, that she doesn't belong. She's already worried other people think this about her. So she doesn't want to vocalize it and bring attention to the issue. So the less it's spoken about, the more entrenched it then becomes. And then it convinces her that this feeling is hers alone to carry. And this silence then becomes self-perpetuating. Because women rarely voice these feelings, others in the same room, often struggling with the exact same doubts, they believe they're the only ones too. And so the result then is this culture where nearly everybody is feeling like an outsider. Yet nobody wants to admit it. Coaches who work in this space with female leaders, myself included, I've often had many moments where a client I'm working with will finally share her imposter feelings. So she'll tell somebody else at work, actually, I've been feeling this way. And then the other person says, you know what? Me too. I had a client once and she shared what she was feeling with somebody, another woman who was senior to her, who she really looked up to, admired, respected. And then this woman turned around and said, I feel exactly the same way. I'm constantly wondering, when am I going to get found out? When am I going to be only a matter of time before they realize that I'm not qualified enough for this and I'm just winging it? And so she felt this sense of relief because she realized, I'm not actually the only person that is battling with this. And here's this woman who I really admire and respect, and she's actually going through the same thing. But in the absence of these kinds of conversations, shame keeps everyone in their own private bubble of doubt. But the reality is, it's very, very common. Studies show that the majority of women, especially those in leadership, have experienced it at some point. Yet the stigma of actually admitting that you've dealt with or struggled with imposter syndrome, it reinforces the illusion of isolation. So instead of recognizing it as this shared experience shaped by cultural and systematic bias, women are carrying this weight alone, which again is just going to deepen the shame. So until the silence is broken, until more conversations are had around this topic, imposter syndrome is going to continue to thrive in the shadows. Now, I think as part of changing the narrative around imposter syndrome, a part of it is really seeing imposter syndrome for what it is, often a reaction to the environments that we have been raised in and that we have worked in, but also a survival strategy. You know, women learn very early on that second-guessing ourselves can sometimes soften the doubt of others. So what I mean by this is we almost anticipate criticism. We do this because we can then prepare our defenses before anyone has the chance to question our competence. So what often looks as hesitation is often this preemptive shield. So playing small, we hear this phrase a lot, playing small, it becomes a form of protection. So let's say a woman downplays her achievements. She stays humble. She doesn't recognize, her achievements to the point of maybe invisibility, or, she avoids drawing too much attention to herself. What she does is she reduces the risk of being labeled as arrogant, being unlikable, being too much. So shrinking herself feels safer than stepping into the spotlight where the scrutiny is going to be much sharper, the backlash is going to be louder. So seen in this light, imposter feelings are less about individual inadequacy and more about this adaptation to a biased system. They're a natural response, imposter syndrome. It's this natural response to environments that have taught women that confidence will be punished. Visibility is going to perhaps be resented. If you're too ambitious, people don't like that. So let's think about the new entrepreneur. Let's say she's at a networking event, she's trying to kind of promote her business, but she starts downplaying her existing success. She downplays her numbers, she downplays her achievements, and maybe in reality her growth is quite impressive for, an early stage business, but she minimizes things to soften any doubts that might surface. So to a room full of people, it might read as modesty, but to her, it's almost like protection. If she lowers her expectations, she can't disappoint anyone. I see this as well, in the coaching space especially. A coach doing really, really well, her first year, she's already made 6 figures, but maybe she finds herself still apologizing for her success. So maybe she's perhaps still, in her corporate job, and she's asked about the work that she's doing on the side, her coaching business. And she might say, oh, I'm just doing this, downplaying the real impact that she's actually having. So again, what looks like on the surface, maybe uncertainty or a lack of confidence, it's actually just a survival reflex. It's an effort to soften the sting of being judged as arrogant or greedy or too much. Now, again, this is a woman that might be very competent, very capable, accomplished, yet she feels like she needs to wrap her confidence in disclaimers. That's not weakness. That lack of confidence that she's purporting isn't a weakness. It's an adaptation to a culture that has trained women to believe that confidence, when unsoftened, is going to be punished. So it's almost like we feel that our confidence, it almost has to be kind of sanded down a little bit with self-depreciation. So when we do achieve something, we might say things like, oh, I just got lucky, or, we really struggle to accept that praise. So really then when we think about imposter syndrome, it's almost the fact that it's there is evidence of how adaptable we've become. The hesitation, the disclaimers, the shrinking, downplaying our strengths. These aren't failures of our character. They're not really showing a lack of confidence. They're really strategies of survival in a system that polices women's confidence much differently than it does a man's. But ultimately, the way that we do adapt ourselves, it comes at a price. So if we're constantly shrinking, softening ourselves, disguising our confidence, over time, this just erodes our sense of worth and our sense of self. And the boundary between strategic humility and genuine self-doubt begins to blur. So what began as protection ultimately morphs into our identity. So we no longer just act uncertain to make others feel more comfortable, to downplay our strengths. We actually start to believe this narrative. Now, one thing I've learned about carrying imposter syndrome around for a very long time myself is that it is exhausting. It's not just about that self-doubt. It's the mental effort of constantly running this internal filter, editing every word, every decision as a way to avoid judgment. And that vigilance, it drains energy that could be spent on creating, on strategy, even just enjoying your work. So, if you've been minimizing yourself for a long time, it's going to take a heavy psychological toll. I've had women describe, and I've had myself had this sensation as well, never being able to relax because we're always bracing ourselves for the moment that we'll be found out. And this tension often translates into perfectionism, working very late to make sure every detail is flawless, over-preparing for meetings or presentations, saying yes to every request to prove our worth. So what maybe started out as a survival strategy, it ends up fueling that burnout. Now, when I think about the solution here, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's featured so heavily in the work that I do, I think one of the biggest solutions is redefining leadership and allowing women to lead in our feminine power. So if you think about the traditional models of leadership, which have been built around control and decisiveness, they punish women for being too strong, yet also dismiss them when they're too soft, when they lean into empathy or collaboration, or if they're emotional. And it's this double bind, not women, that fuels the self-doubt. And feminine leadership is an invitation to break free from this double bind. So allowing things like empathy or intuition or creativity and connection, seeing these things not as weaknesses to tone down, but powerful strengths in our own right. And when women lead from this place, we no longer have to apologize for being too much or fear that we're not being enough. We can actually embody our authority without abandoning our authenticity. True empowerment, what that really means, it means expanding leadership to include the fullness of who we are. And when we do that, imposter syndrome will transform from this private, shameful thing into a call to evolve the culture of leadership itself. Remember that imposter syndrome is not a flaw to fix. It's actually a call for transformation, a reminder that we're not here to prove ourselves within outdated molds. We're here to expand them. And in doing so, we're going to create a future where women can rise fully, freely, and unapologetically in their power. So I hope some of that landed for you today. And remember, if you are looking to explore this work for yourself, or maybe for those women that you want to ultimately lead, then you can head to she-leads.co/free trial registration, where you can actually trial the She Leads Academy for free. I hope to see you in there, ladies. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode. If today's episode lit something up in you and you are ready to build a coaching business that not only changes lives but creates the income and freedom you deserve, then right now you can request a free trial of our She Leads Academy coach training. To get your free trial, just head over to Instagram and visit us at she_leads.academy. You will find the link to the free trial in our bio. I cannot wait to see what's possible for you.